Create on video. Right. Morning, Margaret.
Good morning, darling. How are you? Looking
Not
well.
bad. Yes, and yourself.
Oh, it's fabulous to see you all these old faces there, Mrs. Barbara Sharp now, because she's retired and she doesn't need to keep saying Dr. Sharp. To see you. Now, Eileen, is it? And Adele. Nice to see you, doll. Nice to see you, doll. Oh my, lovely. I'm going to shut up now and pass over to people that know better than me.
Oh.
I think that's most people connecting, so we'll make a start. Good morning and a warm welcome to the last in a series of unique winter seminars and workshops exploring creativity and the arts in dementia research. The seminars have been presented by the University of West of Scotland School of Health and Life Science, Division of Mental Health and Integrated Practice, and Alzheimer's Scotland Centre for Policy and Practice, in collaboration with Alzheimer's Scotland and the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. My name's Hamish Fulford and I'm a lecturer within the Division of Mental Health and Integrated Practice, and I'm here to introduce the third seminar in the series as one of the lecturing team that supported our doctoral students in the organisation and planning of this series. Today's the third exciting seminar and workshop of our winter series, which began last November. The events feature a late morning seminar about the different ways in which arts and creative approaches are being used in research with people with dementia, followed by an interactive, friendly workshop. The workshop will explore the theme of the seminar. All we require is your unique presence and way of looking at the world. You can partake as much or as little as you like, depending on how you feel today. This morning's seminar is being delivered by Carol Beckwith. Carol started as a doctoral student at UWS in October 2020, having gained an honours degree in psychology from Open University in 2014 and a master's degree in songwriting from UWS in 2018. She's interested in how she can use creative practice to tell stories, both her own and those of other people. Carol has always worked either in the NHS or in a health-related industry, and in particular, her time working with public health in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has sharpened her awareness of health inequalities in general, but especially so for those in underrepresented groups. Her research project focuses on the narratives of young onset dementia carers, looking at the experience of being an unpaid carer. Young onset dementia is generally under-researched, and the needs of young onset dementia carers is especially overlooked. Carol's research will specifically look at understanding how they manage the complexities of taking on the role of caring for a younger person with dementia, the particular challenges that this presents and how they support their own health and well-being, particularly in relation to how they retain their own lives and identities. This is a creative project and is practice-based, and the methods reflect this. It uses songwriting, which will sit alongside narrative inquiry, and these will frame the storytelling nature of the research. Beyond being a student, Carol enjoys art, reading, water skiing, and she's an enthusiastic but beginner bonsai gardener. After the seminar and lunchtime break, you're invited to return at 1 p.m. to a workshop offering the opportunity to explore further what Carol discusses this morning. I'm not going to say too much more, as you'll hear all about it from Carol's seminar today. I do, however, hope that you have a really good evening and enjoy today's sessions. We'll be recording this session, but please feel free to screen grab or take pictures of the screen. For those that don't want recorded, just please turn off your video feed. I'd now like to introduce you to Carol. Over to you, Carol.
Carol, can you unmute yourself, Carol?
Sorry. Rookie error. Yeah. So thanks very much for having me as part of this seminar series. It's great to see faces that I recognise, and everybody's been warned not to throw things, metaphorically speaking. And as I was saying beforehand, I hope I'm getting a cut of the ticket money, the door money today. So I am going to share some slides. There aren't too many. And if you can wave at me if you can see what I see. Yeah, great. Just bear with me. Okay. So Hamish has already given a really comprehensive introduction, and so I probably don't need to say too much about that, but just to recap, my session's called Do You See What I See? And you'll understand a little bit of why I've called it that as we go through. And it's just an overview of my approach to my PhD research, and I'll be going from practice to research within my project, and then back from research to practice. And you'll hopefully see the story arc through what I say this morning. As Hamish has already said, my PhD research is focused on carers of people living with young onset dementia. And I'm interested in this because it is under-researched. Most dementia research appears not to focus on the unique challenges or consider these unique challenges that come as a result of caring for someone with young onset. And in particular for me, the most interesting part of what I'm looking to find out is the stories about the journey to becoming a young onset carer. Again, Hamish has referred to the specific challenges or the unique challenges, and I want to hear actually the voice of the carer in this. And through my practice and through my practice as research, I want to be able to amplify that so that other people can hear it too. And I'll use some terminology, and I hope that's okay. And if you've got any questions about what any of it means, then please, ask me at the end or pop it in the chat, and we'll try and navigate that. But I'll use terms like arts-based research, practice as research. I'll talk about crossing thresholds. I'll talk about stories and songs quite a lot. And I'll talk about resonance and liminality. So, do you see what I see? And you might think this is a bit of an odd question to start an academic seminar with. Or you might think it's a bit of a cliche, something that people say when they're trying to position their own argument or point of view. But I think it's fair to say that it can be really difficult to try and understand situations where we haven't gone through that same experience that the person is trying to explain. And in my research, I want to ask that important question. I want to ask, how can I understand something that I've never experienced? And in the context of my research, if I were to ask you what it's like to be you, how can you help me to understand that if I'm not also you? This is a poem which I will read. I have deliberately not put the words up. You may have seen it before. It was written in 1862 by Godfrey Sachs. But it puts that position across really well. And for me, it resonates and echoes the questions that I've already discussed this morning. It's called The Blind Men and the Elephant. It was 6 men of Indostan to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each, by observation, might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, "God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall." The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, "Ho, what have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp. To me 'tis mighty clear this wonder of an elephant is very like a spear." The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, thus boldly up and spake, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a snake." The fourth reached out his eager hand, and felt about the knee. "What most this wondrous beast is like is mighty plain," quoth he. "'Tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree." The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, "E'en the blindest man can tell what this resembles most. Deny the fact who can, this marvel of an elephant is very like a fan." The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, then seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a rope." And so these men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong. And so oft in theologic wars, the disputants, I ween, rail on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about an elephant not one of them has seen. And I talked about the title of my seminar today as being going from practice to research and from research to practice. My studies in psychology, as Hamish has already alluded to, and in music as creative practice have very much influenced my journey till now. And in my master's research project, I took the question, do you see what I see? And I used it in my practice as research to investigate and explore the meanings that were resonating with me within the context of a mental health therapeutic art programme. And again, as Hamish has said, having worked in the NHS as a public health practitioner, I have become acutely aware of how other people's well-being, or how people's well-being can be negatively affected, not just by illness and disease, but by personal circumstances, personal experiences, trauma, and so on. And this has shaped my practice as a researcher, songwriter. And in this PhD, I really want to better explore and understand how creative practice that I use can give voice to those experiences. And songwriting as a research tool has been applied across a breadth of research. And if you were to go into Google Scholar, you would find lots of examples of that. It's been used in therapeutic applications, for example, art therapy, and in mental health settings. It's been used to open up conversations within the criminal justice system. And I've worked on projects that have included even wider subjects, so reminiscence work with those living with dementia, and interestingly, the history and legacy of the sugar industry in Inverclyde. But most recently, I've been involved in a carer songwriting project in Glasgow with my musical collaborator, Pauline, who's on the call today too. Doing exactly what I have been talking about so far and what I will be describing in the rest of the seminar. And the project is called This Rain, and I'm telling you that because I'm going to be referring to it at various points. And storytelling and songwriting are very much interlinked because they're able to capture not only big picture issues, but also the small narratives that people hold very close to themselves. That's stories that are maybe personally important to them, but also stories that have wider community applications and importance, but both of which are often left unspoken. So from practice to research, do you see what I see? Somehow, I don't think that you do. For that to happen, you'd have to be me and I you. And in my research, I want to be, if I can, that other person, to see things, if I can, as they do. Maybe try on their shoes for a few steps. And as I explore their narratives, that's the narratives of young onset dementia carers, by using my creative practice, that's songwriting, I want to find a way to try and get a better understanding of those experiences that I haven't had myself, and then be able to, in some fashion, narrate that through my own practice. This and other related ways of doing things come under the broad heading of arts-based research methods. They commonly rely on a more aesthetic way of doing things, an aesthetic focus, and because of this very thing, it facilitates responsive and organic research and work. It's less likely to be linear, like for example, if you were taking part in research and somebody gave you a multiple choice questionnaire, or if somebody asked you to give a score on a scale of how you were feeling that day. It's reflective and it works well with the narrative inquiry, which I'll also be using to try and draw out the stories. And I want to try and make those stories visible through my practice. But it's not without its challenges. And particularly within the field of health research, there are always going to be ongoing debates about the interplay between creative practice or arts-based research methods within the field of health. And Susan Cox describes some of these challenges as being the struggle to find a shared vocabulary, and that's a vocabulary that's understood between creative practitioners, scholars, health researchers, and frontline workers and communities. And there's a challenge of how we show respect across disciplines. And if we want to work collaboratively, we have to be aware of and respectful of disciplinary difference. And we need to make sure as well, as I have been with this project, this RAIN that I've mentioned, when we work with communities, with people, we need to make sure that they're involved. It's not just a token gesture and lip service where they're kind of added on to give it a bit of credibility. And if we use creative practice, if we use arts-based methods, where does that research sit? And she suggests that we perhaps need to think about how we move the research from the library to the studio, from the conference room to the theatre, and think about how we distinguish between what is scholarship and what is art. So what is it that creative practice brings to my research process? How does it help me to see as you do or understand your experience? To illustrate that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my master's research project, which was called Painted Faces, and you can see in the slide there, the bottom right, images which were created for the album artwork. And I used lyrical and musical inquiry methods to explore and understand some of the stories and experiences that were expressed by mental health users that I didn't know that took part in an art therapy activity. My objective was to try and set about looking through the eyes of the other, literally. Each piece of art that I used had its own story. Each person who made it had their own experience, and they were all almost certainly different to mine. And what I did was I immersed myself in that art. I lived with it, day and night, almost. I was surrounded by it in this room. It was all over the walls. And over time, and it did take time, I began to recognise within it some of the echoes of my own situation, some feelings that perhaps it gave rise to, how it evoked emotions, and so on. And it started to resonate with me as I began to see meaning and construct meaning of my own from it. Essentially, I let the art tell me its story. And as we all do with poetry, with songs, and with all art, I took from it my own meanings based on my own experience. And I was then able to tell my own story based on that, from my perspective and point of view. And if you look at the painting on the left of the slide, when I looked at that painting, all I could see was the back of somebody's head, the slope of their neck and their shoulders, standing for me in quite a barren environment. That was what I saw, and that's only what I saw. And when I discussed it with one of my friends, she said, "Oh, that's interesting. All I can see is a road going into a tunnel." So how do we know what things mean when we don't stand where the creator or the teller or the storyteller is standing? We tell our own version of things. But when we compare notes or trade experience, we begin to see little glimpses of things that we perhaps never saw before. Begin to see things from a different perspective. And it's this sharing that sometimes changes our viewpoint. We might take a step to the left or a step back, and it changes things. And when our view changes, when our stories change and evolve, we change too. And I would suggest that if the blind men had actually talked to one another as they were going along, they might have had a slightly bigger perspective of the elephant than the singular conclusion that each of them arrived at. And I've talked about going from practice to research, but why and how is what I do research? I think first we maybe have to ask ourselves why do we tell stories in the first place? And the research tells us that stories matter. Stories transform situations, they transform experience, and they have a way of bringing people through. But first we need to tell the stories. And Margaret Atwood, I love this quote, famously said, "A story isn't a story until you tell it to someone else or to yourself." And when someone becomes a carer, the research tells us that they go through long periods of waiting, through many, many transitions, often going through lots of changes that impact hugely on their own lives and identities. And at times they may adopt a different perspective from that which they held previously, and they often look at things with a different outlook from that which they had before they became a carer. And it's in these moments of their story that I want to understand and research and explore through my practice. I want to ask them about the changing nature of their journey and the changing of their perspectives, about their experience as they go into, through and out of different stages of their journey. And these places, these moments of change and periods of waiting are described by researchers like and Lindahl as liminal spaces. There's a sense of in-betweenness, of stuckness about their experience, where things that seemed maybe certain before are no longer certain, and their lives often appear to be on hold for that time. And through that liminal space of caring, we understand that actually it's unique to every person, and Kelly talks about that. I want to explore these liminal spaces through storytelling and songwriting. And although that liminal space for the individual can only be occupied by that one person at that time, the stories can be constructed and reconstructed, just as my friend and I did with the painting that I mentioned before. And when Marini refers to stories being bridges for communication, I believe that this restoring of our experience is what she's describing. So, we've got stories, but why songs? Why not just stories? Well, when people are supported to tell their story in creative and different ways, they often unlock parts that have been hidden for a long time and don't always come to light. Sometimes they're quite reluctant to talk about them in a group or with health professionals. And I've mentioned the transformational power of stories, and this applies to songs as well. Hilary Beach describes how songs can help us to open ourselves up to feelings and experience, often helping us to deal with challenges and difficult situations. Think about all the times, for example, that you've taken refuge or solace in music, times of celebration, times of crises, or of heartbreak, if that's been your experience. And they help us to deal with situations. They give us comfort. They often give us power. They energize us, and they make us feel good. And they can change our perspective. They can get us up and moving when we feel stuck, and they help us to cross thresholds in our lives. And in terms of liminality, they help us to move out of our stuckness, out of our own liminal spaces when they are part of our storytelling exercise and experience. And Beach talks generally about how doing and making, so that's art practice, creative practice, craft, anything that's creative, helps us to understand and know ourselves a bit better, helps us to understand and know our experience a bit better. And that this creative spirit, this creativity can help catalyse change and movement, effectively moving us, helping us to move from one place to another and cross some of those thresholds. Felicity Baker is one of the researchers at the forefront of using songwriting with caregivers of people living with dementia in the arena of research. And she describes the storytelling potential of songs and the role in helping people to reconstruct, we've talked about that already, their life narratives, exploring the past, the present and the future, and making sense of all of that, of their lives and circumstances. And she describes also how songs can enhance communication. So I'm sure we've all been in clinical conversations or with social workers or with academics or with any number of people that we come across every day where we struggle to communicate. And I would suggest that in the context of dementia research, creative practice enhances communication, and particularly from my perspective, songwriting and writing songs. And although songwriting as research is not about the novelty factor, for many people it is exactly that. It's new and it's interesting, but more importantly, it opens up possibilities for people that take part that they might never have considered before. In my own experience as a practitioner, using art as method and doing it with other people is a fabulous experience. But what I will say, and one of the main differences that I perhaps would suggest that exists, is that it's different from traditional research, in as much as if I were to do research that was based on filling out questionnaires and taking polls and asking people questions, I wouldn't absolutely have to have a relationship with them. But this work for me always has to be built on relationship, on trust, on listening, on collaboration, mutual respect, and a willingness from all of us to be vulnerable. Beach again describes how once the songs are written, so we've got a group of people and they've written some songs and they've enjoyed the exercise and they see their stories there. But when they look back on that material, when they listen back to the songs, it actually prompts a recollection. It reminds them of the things that changed for them as they went through the process. And it amplifies and illustrates the thresholds that they were crossing as they were doing that. And I've just got a little video clip here of two of the participants, Jim and Tracy. And this video is in the public domain, so it's absolutely fine to share it, talking about their experience. Now, you might have to turn your volume up, and I hope I've shared my computer audio, so please wave at me immediately if you can't hear it.
Once we were in the group and we started to write our stories, you discovered that most of your stories are the same. I think initially I was a wee bit kind of tearful.
It was a bit tearful because if you're not used to talking about it, talking to somebody
Yeah.
who genuinely wants to hear it makes a difference. You wonder how much you should say, but you have to tell the truth. The good bits, the bad bits, you're all going in the same journey.
Talking to somebody that's in the same position as yourself, it makes it easier for you. I think you do kind of open up easier.
Sometimes things you've not said to anyone else before, we could say in that room knowing that it was going to go to a good purpose.
It's getting those feelings out of yourself and the comfort of talking to people that fully understand the position you're in. If anything, I hope people listen to the songs that they can open up rather than maybe harbouring too much within themselves. And when you see the stories then turning into song and hearing the song put together and then actually kind of joining in with it, it's been fun.
It has. It was quite powerful.
I think overall it's a great experience.
Now, I'll be upfront, I'm not a carer, nor have I ever been a carer. So how do I fit into this community of carers when I'm not part of this carer community? You might describe me as, on the slide there, which is just a bit of fun, as an outsider. I don't fit in. I'm not an expert by experience. And I might ask, does this matter? Because I suppose that's a really important question. If it matters, then it matters. But Dwyer and Buckle suggest that I can be both insider and outsider, rather than having to choose a position. Pick a team. I don't have to take up one position. That rather than occupying a role that is wholly one or the other, as a researcher, I can occupy a sort of in-between space in this research. You might describe that as a liminal space, which will be an interesting thing to maybe consider as I go through my research. But I've already talked about the necessity for this kind of work to be built on trust, on relationship, on vulnerability. So I can never be wholly outside of that community or that group. So I am insider, although I'm outsider. And that's probably a question that will be asked over the course of my research. But my answer is, this is not quantitative research. It's not binary. There is no one right answer. And so, from research to practice, what is it exactly that I do? And Chris will recognise this, and hope it doesn't trigger flashbacks for him. But this is a theory model of creativity that I recognised as, when I was doing my master's degree, recognised as the way I do things. But it's probably interesting for you to know what it is exactly that I do, what's my process. For me, songwriting is iterative. Each immersion or stage of the process generates more stages and more data. So each immersion in the data generates more data, more layers. Each act of creativity changes and shapes the thing that emerges. That's the song lyric and the melody. And people have asked me this before, and I've asked lots of other people before what their process is, but being honest about it, I do a fair degree of groping around in the dark, feeling my way during the process. And Guy Claxton refers to this in the book The Intuitive Practitioner as being a process which is implicit rather than explicit. It's hard to explain, easier to do. And it's a method that's often difficult to articulate, as I've already said. It's difficult to comprehend sometimes, even for me. And it's really difficult to rationalise. But for me, it's a way of knowing by doing. I learn and experience as I do things. It's not an academic exercise for me. There is no formula or prescription for it. If I were to describe it more broadly, I could use this stages theory of creativity, which Graham Wallace iterated in 1926, I think it was, and he could see distinct stages of the creative process. And he describes 4 stages here: that of preparation, which is where you gather your data, your information, your listening exercises. And so I visited for my master's project galleries, took notes, took photographs, walked around, tried to find people to talk to. And then you move through a period of incubation where you take the material you have and it feels that it doesn't make that much sense, but by stepping back, and I've talked about taking a step back or a step left, living with it, unconsciously reflecting on it, nurturing it, opening your mind, putting it away. And I've talked about living in this space with the images all around me on the wall. And I would make notes, record melodies, draw pictures. I used thousands of post-it notes. And you move through the period of illumination, which is that eureka moment, that aha, where suddenly something just works and feels right. And then to the verification part of the process, where your ideas come together and you can evaluate them, you can process them and polish them, make small changes. And I would, for example, play them for people, ask people for feedback. And for the project This Rain, we went back to the group and said, look, here's what we've done so far. How does this feel for you? Have we got this right? Do we need to change? And we did make changes based on their feedback. We changed words. Sometimes it would seem a small thing, but it actually made a huge difference for them. And the object, therefore, of the exercise is to amplify the data, amplify the voice of the data of the participants, and to try and bring the research question to life. And then we move to the part where things are finished. And as we know, art is never finished, only abandoned. But there has to come a point where it is left alone to sink or swim. And from, I didn't read through some of the pictures on that previous slide of the notes that I went through when I was writing one of the songs. But from those notes, from those pictures, I wrote this song. And there are parts of it that you can see if you look at them side by side that clearly reflect what was in the picture that it came from. But I did go through the process of preparation, incubation, illumination and verification. And it is the other person's story, but it's also my story. And that is, for me, one of the key things that I need to always remember. It's not about me, but it's always going to be woven through with pieces of me, whether it's my musical inclinations, my stylistic choices, my palette of chords and instruments, and my vocabulary. And so we move on to the researchers' so what. What difference does it make? Why does it matter? Previous research tells us that stories can make a difference, and that creative practice can be more than just music or painting or poetry or theatre. And they can help us to gain insight into the inner places that we often hide so carefully away, trying not to let people see. Creative practice can give these narratives form and shape, and this can be really empowering. And you heard Tracy and Jim talking about that in the video, about how much more they were able to describe of their experience through the process of creative practice. And we didn't always sing songs. We sometimes got in a room with newspapers and scissors and Pritt sticks and lots of boxes of words and materials that weren't their words, but they were able to take them and make them into something else. In the project This Rain, the carers told us throughout the course of the project that while each of their stories were different, they could really see that there were touch points where the experiences were similar. And they were able to talk about these experiences, sharing their frustrations, sharing their triumphs, sharing their knowledge. And this meant that we were able to create songs that had shared meaning. And although the songs meant particular things to individuals, it was that shared story which was the important thing. And telling stories and writing songs in this way is a way that we can listen. And after the project, well, you heard Tracy saying it was really important that they felt listened to. They felt that we'd heard them. And they acknowledged that when we talked to them, but they acknowledged it because they told us that they could hear their stories in the songs. And other people could recognise them too, which was really interesting. So there's definitely something about storytelling and songwriting which brings something unique to the table. And as I've already said, unlike when we do research with what you would maybe describe as traditional research methods, in collaborative arts-based research, the participants are not kept at a distance. They become part of the research. They become part of the data. And both myself as researcher and participants will bring our own insider and outsider positions, our own subjectivities. We will both contribute to the data in a way. We will contribute to how it's constructed, how it's understood. And Wendy Madsen talks about the power in songs that are written as a product of shared writing sessions. And although how each person might write or talk from their own place, whether that's a place of pain or darkness or enlightenment, these places can be transformed, and these voices can be transformed as they work together, as they share stories in collaborative and iterative ways. And it's the knowledge that's created via this process that for me is the so what. Storytelling, songwriting and performance give insight. When we took This Rain out on the road, no, I would say it was like a tour. So we did three performances of the project in different places. Members of the audiences told us that they had been moved by the songs. Absolutely. They told us they had been moved by the music, but they also told us they had been moved by the performances, and that the songs had resonated with their own experience of being a dementia carer. And there were professionals who also attended the performances, and they talked about how powerful the songs were, how they gave them a different perspective, and how pleased they were that the stories had come out in this way because they hadn't ever expected it to happen in that way. And this can maybe be explained by David Carless and Katrina Douglas, who discuss how songs take things beyond the power of abstract concept and facts, and they make them knowing by feeling. Music lets us feel rather than see things. Marini brings us back to that point about our language and how we present data, and how those formal and informal stories help us to build bridges between people and between places, help us to cross thresholds, improve our insight and the insight of other people. They engender empathy and create better communication. Narrative through song is expressive of experience, and it facilitates this listening, this healing process, and it encourages empathy. The written word alone, while good, can absolutely restrict what it's possible to know and what it's possible to share about something. Using creative practice enriches and deepens that experience of listening and understanding. It expands how we can explore, question, and investigate things. And it can be used to start conversations. And I've talked about conversations in the criminal justice system. And if you look up an organisation called Vox Liminis, you'll see how songwriting has been used to start those conversations. And finally, in this reign, we found that creative practice is generative. For the group that were part of it wasn't research, the group that were part of the songwriting project, it was the spark. The project itself was just the beginning. And although we made a CD and we went and performed the songs, it was just the spark that lit that flame of creativity. And for most people in the group, they previously weren't particularly creative. And Beach talks about how it can be really helpful to cultivate a creative spirit. That by liberating a creative process in our own lives, we will often find a way to face up to those things that need attention. So those hidden narratives, those things that are making us stuck, those things that are stopping us from moving on into the next part of our journey. And in this picture here, this is Tracy that you saw in the video, and she's given permission to share this. We set a task, so we'll be meeting on Zoom every month or so, and we've been setting tasks for one another. And this was Tracy's response to the task set. And she looked out of her window, and we asked them to think about, just whatever comes to your mind, just capture it, write it, draw it, sing it, whatever you want to do. It doesn't have to be clever or fancy or use big words or what you would consider good. So, and she drew this. And she drew, first off, the picture on the left, and she described that as a tree of loss. She reflected on her experience as her husband was diagnosed with young onset, and the time that she'd gone through, and all of the things in her life that she had seen as losses. And as she reflected on that, she then began to think in terms of the tree as changing, and she started to think of it as a tree of life, and of newness, and of learning, and of growing. She began to reconstruct her narrative, tell her story. And as Margaret Atwood says, when you tell a story to yourself or to somebody else, then it's a story. Just to finish, here is one of these stories.
Six o'clock, all out of bed, turn the TV on, clear your crowded head, softly stepping on the eggshells of the day. 6 o'clock, same old morning grey. 6 o'clock, gently trace the lines of all the careful plans you've left behind, still hanging on to your Midas life. 6 o'clock, stop, close your eyes. You miss motorways, holidays, baking cakes, the jokes he made, keeping all that's been stolen inside. Motorways, holidays, but you make the best of what you have today, knowing all that matters is time. 6 o'clock, you soldier on, taking stock of all you had that's gone, all you've lost, all you've learned. 6 o'clock, you let the pages turn.
So, happy to take questions, and for anybody's interested, that's some of the references that I have used. I'm sure that'll be of great interest to all of you. Said nobody ever.
Thank you very much for that, Carol. It's Joe Ronan here. I'll just be chairing this bit with the questions. That was such a rich, moving, provoking, generous. I'm lost for words, Carol, but I think your connection with the work you do and the research you're doing, I think everybody in this space felt it. And I think it's rare to be in a kind of conference scholarship platform where we can feel this generosity and depth. So thank you so much for the work you've done on it. For those of you who don't know me, I was formerly a lecturer at UWS for 13 years, acting and performance. And funnily enough, listening to your presentation, Carol, I had to leave to go and find time to do my practice. Because actually, to return to the scholarship, we need time for practice. And sometimes as an academic, it's really difficult to find that time. So I hope to go back to academia at some point, but now it's practice time for me. And more importantly, it's question time for you, Carol. So please unmute your mic. And I'm going to start. I'm sure all of you have lots of questions, but because there was already one in the chat box. So Liv, I'm going to you. Because when you were talking about the insider-outsider status with the work, Liv had a really interesting question about being off the work. And maybe, Liv, you can actually pose that question directly to Carol.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. That was wonderful. So something I, to describe my position as when I go into places and facilitate workshops is being inside either the group or the setting or whatever, but not of it. And I just wondered, when you were talking about liminality and the insider-outsider dichotomy, actually, for me, that's a way of bringing the two together. And I don't know if that resonated or if you thought of something else to describe that space or feeling.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that as the project spanned a period of, so obviously my research period is going to be long. I'm doing this part-time, so I'm going to be here for a long time. I'm going to be very old when I'm finished. But for This Rain project, we started in May and we didn't conclude it until December. So it was quite a long time to be with people. And at the beginning, I very much felt, so Polly, my musical collaborator and partner, is an ex-carer. Her mum had dementia, and she very, very much felt at home from the word go. I very much did not feel at home within the conversations. So I became, over a period of time, more comfortable with that, and I felt over time more part of the group. And it actually reached a point where I didn't feel outside. So I felt of the group as well as being an outsider, if you like. I don't know if that doesn't answer it in a particularly academic way, but I think there's an element of that liminal space that I was sitting in at the beginning, that I actually transitioned through. And I never really thought about it until I started preparing this session and started looking at insider-outsider theory. But I definitely went through a process, and I was more probably insider than outsider by the end of it.
Thank you very much, Carol. Is there anyone? Yes, I think Stuart has his hand up. So Stuart, if you unmute your mic, yep.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Carol. That was so brilliant. I could have listened to it for hours. It's so clear and sensitive and, like Joe said, generous. And so I don't have a question. It's just a response. You made me think of something. You reminded me of something I read a while ago when you were talking about how, say, like traditional research feels like it holds a mirror up against something, in that kind of 8 out of 10 owners say their cats prefer dog food or something, in that way. And that you were positioning practice research as being somehow different from that kind of hard mirror. And I read something once which said, imagine that practice-based research was more like a sympathetic string on like a cello, where, you know, one string is being played, but the sound is created because the string next to it is also wobbling. So I like to imagine sometimes that a practice-based researcher like yourself, you're this sort of sympathetic string next to the main one that's being sounded. And the whole only makes a lovely sound because you also are vibrating sympathetically with it. I think it's a really nice model of the kind of knowledge that this creates. But then I suppose if there is a question, it's like, how do you stay sympathetic? Like, as a researcher in that situation, and your whole role is to be open and to kind of feel and vibrate along with the thing that you're dealing with. How do you protect yourself, and how do you stay sympathetic and able to relate in that way?
Yeah, and I suppose it's, yeah, I know it's not a question, but it's, for me, there is an element of that is for the group when we went through the project, and as it will be as I go through my research, it got very, very hot, very emotional at points. And at the point where I felt like an outsider, that was much easier to deal with. It didn't affect me in the same way. I know it affected Pauline quite deeply. But that's actually maybe quite a good thing, because, you know, there's a slightly standing back position that I was able to take and manage the situation in a different way while still allowing for it to happen. So I don't know if that would be something that would continue to go on, but when I listen to that song, I know I wrote it, so, you know, I know, well, Polly and I wrote it, but when I listen to that cello, I absolutely understand what you're talking about, and it gets me right here, and it's the resonance of it, and it's the what's the musical term? Somebody help me, for when the music fits the lyric and the sense. Pauline? Prosody. It's prosody. So, you know, so the music and the lyric and the whole harmonic structure of it supports the thing that's being said, if you like. And that's why music matters. So we could have set that to a different tune. But anyway, so I digress, but I totally take your point, and I think there has to be an element of safeguarding as well. So as you do if you're any therapeutic practitioner, you have to have a place where you can be safe and offload. Louise, you're hep for that one.
Pauline, I wonder if you wanted to say anything, because we don't hear from the collaborators a lot, and obviously you've been an integral part of this process, and I don't know whether, Pauline, you wanted to say anything. So unmute yourself, please, if you can. Yes.
Yeah, I'm very aware it's Carol's seminar, and I'm not usually known for sitting this quiet. It's quite difficult to sit in my hands, but I think she gave an excellent presentation on the work so far. Just touching on the insider-outsider part that Carol spoke about in the emotional part, we'd actually spoken to another friend who's a much more experienced songwriter and facilitator of this type of work prior to it, and she did say to us, one of the things you have to remember is this is about them, it's not about you, so you have to take that step back. And while I try to do that as a health facilitator, I've came through the same professional route as Carol, and I'm very used to that. I'm very used to safeguarding other people, but when you immerse in something that's so personal, it's very, very difficult. And I found sometimes I was the insider, sometimes I was the outsider, but as Carol said, although she didn't have the direct caring experience, she supported me a lot when I went through that carer experience at particularly stressful points in time. So I feel she did have an insight, but she was able to be a bit more objective than I was when we immersed in the work. But actually, in terms of building up that trust with the carers, I've put a comment there, the carers themselves will tell you, we started as strangers and they were very hesitant and a bit uncertain about what they were letting themselves in for, but they agreed to take part. And I think part of that initially was because I basically said, well, I know where you're coming from, because, you know, I was a carer myself, so I understand how difficult it is to talk. And actually in one of the sessions I tried to talk, we were talking about something and Carol played a different song and I just burst into tears. And from then on, I think that just up. Carers themselves said after it, you know, we really felt as though you and Carol both really understood what it was like and what that stress is like and the pressures on your life. And they then said they were actually opening up and telling us things that they'd never told anybody, even the key workers and counsellors that were supporting them. They'd never actually shared some of that information. So it was, I think it was very powerful, and it was an absolute privilege to share those stories with them. And I think Carol's done an excellent job of setting this in a more academic framework, a more structured research framework, which is absolutely brilliant, you know. And it's great that we're continuing to work on the next stage of the project, which we're continuing with the same carers and adding new carers in. So hopefully much more of the same in the future.
Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
Thank you for that, Pauline. I'm just looking, Kirsten Anderson, because there are two Kirstens, I think, on the platform. You're saying the lovely things on the chat. I wonder if you could unmute and maybe talk to some of those points. Are you okay about doing that, Kirsten?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Carol, that was an excellent presentation. And to follow up what Pauline was saying, it's such a lovely, and careful, thoughtful way of putting this within an academic context. And it's such an interesting thing as someone who also, I'm sure there are a number of people in the group today who have a foot in both of these worlds of the arts and academia. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm a lecturer in criminology at UWS. And my background is in the arts. I used to teach music in New York City, and a lot of my work looks at music and criminal justice. So I just thought you gave a great presentation, Carol, and I'm so excited to read your work. And I think that it's really powerful. It shows very well and very clearly the power of the arts to engage with us as humans, whatever your perspective, whether you're looking at that from an artist perspective or from an academic perspective. And my hope for this work, my hope for your work is that, you know, it's because we can see the value of this, in this case with carers, that we will start to fund and put money towards these projects, real money and value and support, and especially because this is a group of people that often are left behind, you know, and aren't supported. And if it wasn't for people like yourself and Pauline, you know, going in and leading this work, you know, they would be even more left behind. And so that's really exciting to see. And I'm really proud of you.
That's lovely, Kirsten. So thank you so much for that, Kirsten. I see Beverly, you had your hand up. Is Beverly around?
Yes, I'm
Beverly,
here.
you want to ask your question? Yes.
Yes, Carol, thank you very much for the presentation. It certainly resonated with me, and especially your song and the notion of time, and the only thing left being time. And certainly, I can fully appreciate that when I was caring for both my parents. So yes, thank you very much, Carol. Most people are talking about it from a kind of emotional and musical perspective. I was quite interested in your discussion about liminality. I looked at the concept of liminality as part of my own PhD. So I've got some literature that I think might be quite helpful for you, Carol. It looks at it more from an academic perspective, but it's Landon Mayer. I don't know if you've read any of their work.
Not sure. I might have.
No.
I've got so many things, but
yeah.
Yeah,
But I'll send you the references, Carol.
Thanks, Beverly.
What I really like about it is that it talks about that sense of being troubled and feeling really uncomfortable in that liminal space, and about, you know, not really knowing how to get your head around it, and not really knowing how you got out the other end of that liminality. and having a kind of new understanding of what you're going through. So it's more from an academic perspective in regards to learning, but I think that some of the literature might resonate with you, Carol. So I'll email you directly in your supervisory team some of the references, but thank you, Carol. I really enjoyed that session. It certainly did resonate with me, so thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Beverly. We are desperately running out of time, so we're just going to take 2 more questions because there's so many questions coming up. So Carol, look at what you've started here. So maybe our last 2 questions can come from Mike, because Mike, you put it very profoundly, the question you were asking, and then we can close with Barbara before we pass to Margaret to close the first half. So Mike, do you want to go?
Okay, thank you. Hi, Carol. Good to see you.
Hi, Mike. Thanks.
Yeah, I've put the question in the chat as well, but I was struck when you were talking about this inside-outside dynamic again and moving between the two. And what I heard you also talking about was the kind of the way we as performers, particularly when you're up there on your own with a guitar and a mic and an audience in front of you, how, you know, one of the things you have to do as a performer is manage that space between you and the audience. Sometimes become part of the audience. Sometimes you need to step back in order to manage the performance. And it just struck me that what you were describing as a researcher sounded very much like that relationship. And I wondered whether your experience of being a performer helped you manage that as part of the research process.
Thanks, Mike. I was processing the question as I was trying to listen as well to Joe. Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And interestingly enough, for me, I think from my perspective, I feel much more at home as a researcher than a performer, and I'm able to move in and out of that space a bit more easily. And I talked about, obviously, the project last year, starting off feeling quite uncomfortable and quite inadequate and unskilled and over the process. And that's kind of how I feel mostly when I'm performing, and I don't perform that often. But I think it's easier for me to transition through that as a facilitator of creative practice than as a performer of creative work. I think there is no doubt I'm not a natural, you might disagree, I'm not a natural performer, I don't think. But a lot of that is about skill and ability. And I think my abilities are much more sharpened in terms of being a facilitator than a performer. But I totally see what you're saying, yeah. And I've copied the chat out because I'm interested in it.
Carol,
I am, of course, going to disagree.
Oh, sorry, Mike, go for it.
No, all I was going to say, I am, of course, going to disagree about your abilities as a performer. But,
yeah. And Carol, I was going to tell you my speciality is getting these people who think they're not performers out of the closet. So Barbara, I want to just close with your question because Barbara has the biggie. She's got the question about humanity. So over to you, Barbara.
Thank you. And thank you, Carol. That was absolutely wonderful, totally absorbing. It struck me again about this insider, outsider perspective. And, you know, a little bit of personal information. I became, I suppose, what you describe as a carer of someone with dementia 18 years after working in the field of dementia professionally. And I felt as if you constantly are straddling the insider outsider bit, because I could be in the company, for example, in support groups, etc., of other carers saying, you know, of course we feel like this, and I'm sitting thinking, I don't feel like that, you know, because every carer experience is so personal, the relationships are so personal. So we're drawing, I think, constantly from life experience and emotion and, you know, our empathy as I say, our common humanity. So to some extent, I don't know that we're ever inside or outside totally the camp, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe some of the things that I learned was that, yeah, as an outsider, I would have said, well, carers experience this or carers experience that or carers feel like this or that. But as we talked, each of them had a different response to each of their different but similar experiences. So each of them had gone through a diagnosis, had met with clinicians, had been given support or not. You know, each of their story was constructed for them themselves, by them themselves, based on what happened, and they were able to share that. And I think that was one of the benefits. And I think that for me, that's one of the so what's of it, is if we can learn what the gaps are through this practice, through this research, then we can start to look at how to address those gaps.
And I think what the experience taught me was more of that, rather than you being able to relate better, I mean, there are some things, but I think rather than broadly being able to relate better to other people who are also caring at that time, I think the biggest learning curve was about myself. You know, because being in that situation just really shakes up your perspective of yourself in so many ways.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you very much, Carol. And over to Margaret to maybe close the session, because we're coming back, so we really do have to round up.
I think we need to close because people do need a cup of tea before the second session. God knows what Carol's going to do to us in the second session. So Carol, thank you. That was I would describe as deeply thoughtful and measured. I really, really enjoyed that. And I'm part of Carol's supervisory team, so I'm very proud of her today. I wanted to say something about when I was a nurse, a mental health nursing community. There was a researcher, and he used to write about the cup of tea, and he described your role as related to the tea. So when I get into somebody's house to see them, it was whether or not I took a cup of tea told me what role I was going to take in the interview that day, which I thought was absolutely amazing. I'll leave that thought with you. What I would say, I know we've got practitioners here who I know. I think this is the closest I've ever seen to evidence and research being interesting to practitioners. Because I think they must really see the point now of actually having evidence to do your practice. Anyway, I'm going to stop and close now, and we're going to, if you can put off your mics and your videos and go and have your lunch and come back at 1 and reopen them, or you can reconnect through the link that you got already. Both ways will bring you back in, and you do have a link if you get a bit stuck. We do hope you'll come back. This is the last of our 3 seminars. Our students have been superb all the way through. We've so enjoyed it. I look forward to it tremendously. Do come back, because it deepens and makes more thoughtful what Carol's already done for us. So please go and eat, and we'll see you at 1 o'clock. And please don't forget to come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. See you.
Bye.
Yeah.
That's great, Carol.
Yeah, it was great. Well done, Carol. I think it's fantastic, and maybe the team will want to come back together before we open at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah,
well done, Carol.
Thanks, everyone.
Maybe 10 too. That was fantastic, Ken. Well done, and I look forward to the afternoon now. I'm going to go and eat.